What's going on, you guys? X-Men, Dark Phoenix has been unleashed upon theaters. That is bringing the Fox chapter of X-Men to a close. What do we think about the journey X-Men have taken from the animated series to the movies? Where will it go now that it's potentially part of the MCU? We're about to break that down with an amazing panel of experts. First off, we have the creators and writers of the X-Men animated series, Erik and Julia Lewald. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Oh my goodness, this panel, this is an amazing panel. I have to say that again and again because I'm excited to break down the stuff with these folks. Right over here, he's the screenwriter of Thor, X-Men First Class, and currently on Netflix, check out Rim of the World, Zack Stentz. Welcome to the party. And this gentleman, he is an esteemed nerd. You know him from Nerdist, Hyper RPG, DC Daily, and El Rey Nation, Hector Navarro.
Thanks, everybody. Wow.
So this is a great panel. So I think everybody here digs the X-Men a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had that theme song stuck in my head for most of my life. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get in the Wayback Machine. Let's talk about one of the first and best incarnations of X-Men that we've seen, the animated series.
My observation is I think that your series and some of the other animated superhero shows of that time were kind of the secret parents of the comic book movie renaissance.
Absolutely, 100%, 100%.
Because literally a whole generation of kids, they weren't reading comic books because comic books they weren't 15 cents anymore. They were already too expensive and they weren't in supermarkets the way they used to be. Yeah. Their introduction to these characters was via your show, and by the time they hit their teenage years and young adulthood, that was when the movies started appearing, and they were primed to become fans. So shows like yours don't get nearly enough credit for kind of paving the way for this cultural moment that we're in now.
Yeah, I said it before we started. The Marvel animated universe, and specifically X-Men, the animated series, they had to walk so that the movies could run. There was stuff that I might not have picked up on as a kid watching the show, but going back and rewatching it as an adult, I am blown away at how much of this show is about the persecution of different people, the othering, the scapegoating, the real core themes of what makes the X-Men, universal, those concepts of this person's born different, therefore we're going to put them in internment camps, we're going to round them up, we're going to all of that stuff. Powers and all the flashy stuff aside, that stuff was great, but I was so surprised how much of that made it into the show. And you guys, before we started shooting, were telling me they let us pretty much, we were flying under two radars, the Marvel and the Fox radar, because they were saying push it. So the show had so much of that.
That's a great point. So the subtext and the actual text of the social issues and what X-Men says about humanity, tell us how that affected your writing.
There were two main themes that we could figure out in the first 20 years of the books, and one of them was the X-Men fighting against evil mutants, and that was just kind of more of a live wrestling struggle or gladiator, who's going to beat who, which is fun and fantastic, and it's things kids love. But the other thing was this sense of exclusion and Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King in terms of, we have a minority? Do you want to try to integrate? Do you want to try to have, a separate nation? How do you deal with people's differences? And that seemed to be much more, the more intriguing as far as storytelling went. So we specifically, consciously focused on that and said, okay, well, who will set this up best? And the Sentinels, for 2 or 3 reasons, were the perfect villain for the first series because they're like this walking embodiment of human intolerance towards mutants. Yeah. They were the Gestapo coming out to round up the Jews, and at the same time, there's something we could blow up on kids' television.
No blood.
We couldn't hit someone in the face. You couldn't see blood. You couldn't stab anybody. There would be these huge fights among these incredibly powerful beings, and that's one of the frustrations of children's television is that if that was realistic, there'd be a lot of harm going on. Well, you can't show it. Well, you can show it to robots. So that way, all these frustrations of these people could be taken out on the Sentinels.
In the pilot episode, when Wolverine comes off the jet and punches Cyclops in the stomach for presumably leaving Morph behind, that was...
It took a week.
That took a week to get that permission to allow a human to punch another human in the stomach, and it never happened again in the show.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd speak to that a little. That sometimes the straitjacket of having to produce things for kids or something like that forces you. Do you find that there are places where it forced you to be more creative?
Absolutely. There's a pace and an intensity to our show that if we'd been allowed to use casual violence, which we weren't, we wouldn't have pushed ourselves that hard to make it as intense emotionally as we did, because we needed to do that because we couldn't show sex, we couldn't show most violence, so we had to make it character stuff. You're perfectly right. The limits focused us, and it ended up being helpful.
And as Hector and Zack so eloquently pointed out, your show stands as a true precursor and the seeds, it seeded the clouds for these films for what we have today. So let's start with the first trilogy. X-Men came out in 2000. It was a box office success, ninth highest grossing movie of 2000. Talk to me about your thoughts on that film, how it resonated, and how you saw it compared to the show.
I know you were mentioning earlier, Zack, that sort of being the perfect target demographic. I was growing up on the show, so now I'm in my early teens, and the movies start coming out, and I'll never forget when it opens up on the boots walking through the mud in the Holocaust, the Magneto storyline, which, going from the show, learning about the comic books, and learning about that character, I think I was still, as a young person, blown away that this movie, which was a PG-13 action, 4-quadrant, blockbuster movie for everybody, and this was only a couple years after I had learned about World War II and the Holocaust in school, I go to see that real-world parallel put into this big fantasy thing with a bunch of superheroes. So the first movie, I think, we were talking about the limitations, the budgetary limitations, the fact that it was focused as a character piece, I think was so smart, so successful, and introduced the sort of larger world, even though it did poke fun at the yellow spandex.
You actually go outside in these things? What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Maybe in retrospect, we didn't have to do that, didn't have to be that embarrassed about making an X-Men movie, but I think overall, all of the decisions that they made were really, really smart to be able to introduce these characters and these concepts to a worldwide audience.
But that's really funny that you say that, because starting off in the Holocaust like that, it's like you have the specter of Schindler's List in the 90s, just a few years prior.
Saving Private Ryan, and yeah, for sure.
How did you guys feel about the film in 2000?
Relieved, for one thing, because they got so much of it right. I mean, that's going into it after having lived with these characters for 5 years, and thinking that we know them as well as anybody does, and having this kind of a familial interest in them, that there were a few things we would have done differently. I think they underserved the women.
Yes.
In our show, we tried to highlight how strong Storm and Rogue were, and Jean Grey, and how big a part they were of this world. And I don't think Halle Berry had anything to do in the first movie. And
It was very satisfying to see that the team they chose pretty much reflected the team that you chose going into what became X-Men.
And we kind of expected it, because the screenwriter spoke to us afterwards, and we'd seen it in print, that they hadn't gone back to the comics, that their reference point was our show.
Absolutely.
That,
You could tell.
They said they didn't touch a comic book, they just watched it. And was it Hugh Jackman evidently went up to Cal Dodd, our Wolverine, said, "I'm so tired of listening to your voice."
Gene.
I will say that the concept of a superhero genre, which we're talking about now, that didn't exist prior to, I say, 2000, with X-Men, the movie, coming out. You had Batmans, you had Supermans, and those, but those were
every
one-offs.
other decade, you get a couple, and then they'd fade out, and you get a couple, and they'd fade out.
But now the superhero is a genre now. It is a category of film, like Westerns, like musicals, like film noir, and I think I give all credit to X-Men.
And after I was going to say, and it needed that after 1997, I believe it was, Batman and Robin. Yeah. I think a lot of people were like, I think the comic book movie is kind of done. And then the next, I think it was 98, Blade came out, and it was like, oh, maybe there's a little life in there yet. Yeah. But then to me, it was that 1-2 punch of X-Men and then the Raimi Spider-Man that was both of them doing blockbuster business. that really paved the way for what we're in now.
And speaking of blockbuster business, X2, X-Men United, was a huge movie as well, 407 million worldwide, and a lot of fans feel this is the best of the X-Men films. Yeah.
Well, because again, it's so funny that everything we've been talking about, it went back to the mutant versus human. They brought in William Stryker. Let's explore the backstory of Wolverine a little bit, because he was such a fascinating character, and Hugh Jackman was the breakout star of the first movie.
We'll be watching.
But to bring it back to that human versus mutant fight, I think makes that one of the strongest entries. And the really exciting thing as a comic book fan was to see the Phoenix in the water at the end of of X-Men 2 was was such a great way to end that movie, because oh no, it's like Femke Jensen died. Couldn't they have used a bunch of mutant powers to? No, she died. Oh well, and then you see the Thing, and you're like, oh, the next one's gonna be great, and then it wasn't so great. But yeah.
Okay, so X2, beloved. X3, people, the Last Stand.
You know what scene did it for me that just made me realize, wow, the people making this have no feel for the characters? Lay it on me. That scene where Magneto sends the almost all mutants of color forward.
In chess, the pawns go first.
And it's like, they've spent 2 movies and 30 years of comic books describing how, or showing how Magneto loves the mutants, and he's all about protecting the mutants, and then he's going to send them out in a human wave attack. Like, that's
Operation Human Shield. No.
Yeah, that is. I'm sorry, that ain't Magneto.
Yeah, and they both he and Xavier are always appealing to mutants to follow them, and you can't ask people to follow you if you just throw them away in a war. And I think our son leapt up in the middle of X3, saying, "Juggernaut's not Australian."
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
Yeah, there were certain things. I think my memory of it, because it's very vague now, but it was kind of too jam-packed with, and here's 3 or 4 people bursting through buildings, and too spectacle, too full of people, and not focused on the story, and missing very important character points.
And then when you sell the movie as we are going to knock over the status quo and change everything, and the last 2 coda scenes of the movie are Xavier's still alive. Maybe Magneto hasn't lost his powers after all. That's like, okay, then what did I just see for the last hour and a half?
2 cheats, 2 double cheats. I hate.
That's in TV writing. We always used to say, can we buy it back? And it's like, well, if you buy it back, why did you sell it to begin with?
We kind of hit the first trilogy. Let's talk about the spin-offs, and then we'll move on to the later X-Men films, including Zack's. So you had mentioned Wolverine. That has been a hit and miss affair.
He mentioned the Wolverine.
The Wolverine.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so the first one, Wolverine.
X-Men Origins Wolverine.
That was a bit uneven. We had Wolverine, we had Sabretooth,
Some great cast.
We had
Deadpool.
Yep. How did we feel about this film overall?
Great cast.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bummer, because even the X-Men films that I don't love but I really like, I'll watch them over and over again. I think I've only seen X-Men Origins Wolverine 1 time. I think X-Men Origins Wolverine is, I think, the best example of the sort of the cliched problems, I think, in Hollywood not really working on that side of the industry, of the too many cooks in the kitchen, the kind of, missed opportunities. All of that stuff is all in that film.
I'm a friend. What's my name? What's my name? Your name is Logan.
There's this thing that Hollywood does, which is take a director who did a small movie and immediately give them $150 million. And Gavin Hood is a really talented director. I've seen the South African film that he made that got him the Wolverine movie. It's very good, but directing a $150 million movie is a completely different skill set. It's largely traffic management and making the studio executives not feel nervous when they show up on set and wonder where all of their money is going. And it felt like he was, like he needed another maybe medium-sized film like Chris Nolan got.
So did the somewhat underperformance of X-Men Origins Wolverine pull the rug out from under a seemingly a series of X-Men Origins blank character films?
It did and it didn't. There were several X-Men Origins spin-off movies in development that did get killed, kind of like these Star Wars ones have been. But one of them was a script called I, Magneto that was Sheldon Turner and then rewritten by David Goyer, and scenes of which ended up getting folded into X-Men First Class. That's why Sheldon Turner has shared story credit on X-Men First Class over the vehement opposition of some of the other parties. Is that the Fox executives were finding pieces of that film and saying, well, we like this scene and we like this scene, so incorporate into the final movie. The Auschwitz opening of X-Men First Class, where we go back to the first movie, but then pull back the curtain and see that there's a villain, a mutant villain watching the whole thing, who's like a Mengele figure. That was in there. That was in the Magneto script. Even the line "peace was never an option" and the line between rage and serenity, those were both in the Goyer draft of the Magneto script.
The Nazi hunting, when he goes to Argentina and hunts some Nazis?
No, that was actually in a draft by Jamie Moss. He was the writer on X-Men First Class before us. That was the one scene that he did that we largely started over again. But like that scene was so good that we're like, okay, we're using this.
That's very cool.
But I just want to talk about a couple more of the spin-offs. So the Wolverine, where Hugh Jackman went to Japan, and a lot of elements of samurai films in this movie. Thoughts on the Wolverine?
I think James Mangold did a wonderful job with it, and I think it was such a great proof of, and I kind of heard this after the fact, of Mangold bringing that movie after it had come out to the studio and going, hey, you know what? If the next go-around, if you kind of let me even do more, it can be better. And then we ended up getting Logan. Yes. And so I think so many people have talked about the 2/3 of that movie being so solid, and then maybe a third of it maybe not working as much, maybe having some of that Hollywood movie studio influence of, well, we got to have a big metal bad guy, and we got to have those kinds of things that I think can be forgiven, because the rest of the film of just Hugh Jackman and a wonderful cast of Japanese actors doing some really great dramatic stuff.
I see you on your back. There's blood everywhere.
I think you can forgive the very kind of cliched superhero Hollywood movie stuff because the rest of that stuff is so solid.
Absolutely. I mean, a grounded genre movie compared to
different
the misfire of the first Origins.
Yeah, as much of a cliche as it is to take away someone's powers, it really works in there, because all of a sudden this guy is vulnerable in a way that he's never been before. And it's it's kind of, we actually pitched on that movie at one point before we didn't end up getting it, but when James Mangold was telling us the concept, we really sparked to it, because fundamentally it was like a guy who has lived too long and wants to die but can't meets a character who is filled with life and wants to live, but whose life is running out. And how those and that's just a great elemental conflict.
So after that, speaking of just a departure, the Deadpool films brought a whole new element and character and sensibility. Were you surprised, I'll throw this out to everybody, about the success and how well this movie translated?
Yes and no. As a comic book fan, I wasn't surprised, because I was in the same corner that Ryan Reynolds was in, being such a fan of the character.
Yeah.
I was in the corner of, Ryan Reynolds going, no, you guys don't understand. Comic book fans have been telling me about this guy for a long time. I know that I can knock it out of the park. I know what this character can bring to not just the X-Men franchise, but to this genre in general, if we're allowed to be full-on Deadpool and don't worry about some of that other stuff. And so on that side, I was not surprised at the movie successfully pulling that off. I think it had all the right elements. On the other side, I'm completely blown away that movie even came out and did so well. Like, I'm so blown away that it was as rated R as it was. I mean, talk about a tonal shift. This was just insane.
Here's the thing, though. that movie came along at exactly the right point in the superhero movie cycle to be appreciated. If the exact same movie had come out in 2005 or even 2009 or 2010, I don't think it would have been nearly as much of a success because the audience hadn't had 15 years of those tropes and cliches in some cases for Deadpool to come along and make fun of.
Superhero landing! Yeah, that's really hard on your knees.
You know, it's one of the reasons why I think the old version of The Tick never did as well as it should. The audience wasn't familiar enough. The audience wasn't familiar enough with those tropes to realize what was being made fun of.
Yeah, this was a product of X number of years of superhero films.
Exactly. Though there's and I'm interested in what you both think about this. The slyest thing to me about the first Deadpool movie is for about 15 minutes, it's a full-on X-Men movie, but like old school, like comic book more like the comic book X-Men and the animated X-Men than any of the movies have been, and it totally works. The whole like Colossus and Negasonic Teenage Warhead is the trainee and the teacher, like that just, it feels like it straight out of the comic books.
Yeah, absolutely. Thoughts on?
Well, and somehow to their credit, Marvel has been able to keep making the superhero genre film, but there's such variation in there. There's the Western with Logan. There's the dark R-rated comedy with Deadpool. It's not just a superhero movie. They've come up with all these different variations.
Absolutely right. That now there was enough stuff to refer to, and also I think if it had been the third or fourth movie, people would wonder why, might have been uncomfortable with it, but there's gotten it become so much part of the culture that it was time to shoot it. And he was allowed to make it so different. Yeah. And we just came out of the theater exhilarated saying, we weren't expecting this.
So we got a very different kind of R-rated X-Men movie with Logan, and how did that film resonate with you guys?
Beautiful. We actually were able to spend some time with Len Wein before he passed, and he was able to see it. The guy that created and really loved it, and talk about how true it was to the character, and what a great way to go out. I personally, I find the last little bit, like the third act, a little bit sloppy in terms of, okay, we're getting up to the mountains and we're going to resolve this. I find that a little bit awkward, but 90% of the movie, it's just spot on, and they got the mood, and talk about a way to ground and make human these guys' lives, and we've known, Wolverine's 110. He's seen too much. We kept on talking about when we were doing the show in the 90s. He's world weary, and people got tired of hearing that. Yeah. But that movie was as world weary as you could get, and you really pulled for them, and it was intricately, beautifully done, bring the girl in, and it was.
Yeah. Great way to, in a lot of ways, sort of end that chapter of the X-Men film series with Patrick Stewart and Hugh Jackman just delivering, I think, their best performances as those characters up to that point.
Okay, so we talked about the original trilogy, we talked about some of the spin-offs. Now, the new X-Men saga, we had already touched upon it a bit, but please regale us with stories from First Class.
No, I mean, if you know professional sports at all, Fox very much was going into First Class as a franchise rebuilding year. Yes. It was they recognized that even though those last two movies had made a lot of money, that they maybe hadn't been beloved. And it was, okay, we've got a new cast. We're going back to the origins in the 1960s, and this is a chance to start fresh again. And we had 10 days to write the first draft of the script, because in typical Fox fashion, they had a release date and no script. Wow. And they wanted to get a hot director onto it, and they were already circling Matthew Vaughn at that point, and they needed a script good enough to get him onto, and so they set us loose, and 10 days later, and no sleep, we managed to get a green light.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew Vaughn, the script, and then the casting. I mean, how do you fill the shoes of Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen? McAvoy and Fassbender are so great.
I was in. There's construction going on in our house, so I was writing the script, co-writing the script in a little office next to my favorite Fox executive who was in charge of it. And I was 10 o'clock at night, and it was like, Zack, come in here. I want to show you the chemistry read we just did with, because they were thinking of a couple different guys for Magneto at that point. The other one was the guy they ended up casting in Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Really good actor. Okay, yeah. But they said, he was saying this guy Fassbender, like some of the executives think he's too old, think he plays too old next to McAvoy. And we watched the tape, and it was them doing a scene together, and Fassbender still had this ridiculous, like Daniel Day-Lewis, and There Will Be Blood mustache, because he was doing the Freud and Jung movie with David Cronenberg at the time. But as soon as he opens his mouth, it's like, oh my God, this is a superstar. This is the guy. This is the guy, and they were so good together. And I was like, look, Drew, and this is important to the characters. Charles grew up in a mansion. Yeah. Erik grew up in a concentration camp. So if one of them looks a little older than the other, it's not the years, it's the mileage. He's been through some stuff. Yeah, he's been through some stuff. And I heard not one person when that movie came out said, I really liked it, except Fassbender was a little too old. Not one person.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think if we contributed one thing to that script, and there were a lot of contributors to that script, it was the idea that if you're going to show them young, don't show them as the same people, only younger. Right. Show them as the people they were before the events that you see shaped them into the characters we know and love from the first three movies. That's why it was, originally, like the script that we saw, you first see Charles, what is he doing? He's giving a lecture where he's giving essentially that speech, the opening speech about mutation from the first movie. Right. And it was, okay, what if he's not giving a lecture? What if he's giving that speech, but he's using it to pick up a girl in a bar? Because he's a callow, he has the seeds of greatness, but he's still a callow, horny young dude.
Xavier. Charles Xavier, how do you do?
Emin.
Heterochromia was in reference to your eyes, which I have to say are stunning. One green, one blue. It's a mutation. It's a very groovy mutation.
Exactly. And what if we show, and what if we show Erik, where he's an angry young man, he's killing Nazis, but he could go either way. There is a chance that he might be one of our core good guys. Yeah. But the tragedy of that movie is his past and the events of the movie teach him, don't trust humans.
Yeah. I mean, I just love that film, X-Men First Class, and it was an amazing bridge between the future and what had come before. So yeah, X-Men Days of Future Past. We talked about a soft rebuild, hard reboot with X-Men Days of Future Past, yeah? And a lot of people love this movie. Some people are a little bit divisive. What are your thoughts?
Having had the chance to work on that story back with the animated series, it was like, ooh, I want to see what they're doing now.
You know what's so interesting? You guys almost did the same thing. In your episodes, Wolverine was going to go back in time. You had Wolverine about to go back in time at first, and then they said, you're too old, old-timer.
You're too old, Bishop's going.
And so we said Bishop, but the idea of a body going, or Wolverine being the central instead of Kitty Pryde or whatever, and then the movie did that,
I still slightly prefer what we did with the story, as far as it not being just about Mystique's DNA, and why don't you just lock her up somewhere and then go shoot this guy yourself? We liked the idea that there was some terrible problem, and that one of the X-Men might have to be sacrificed, and all the other ones thinking about that, and is there a traitor among us? And when we laid out the premise, when Mark and I laid out the premise to start it, he even did it so that it wasn't just Gambit that was suspicion. Everybody had some suspicion. It just became too big. but having the suspicion about somebody you care about, a family member, are we going to have to kill him to preserve the future, was tighter dramatically for us. But all the elements you're talking about were true. It's a good movie, and just having all these special people playing the characters, it just was,
a smorgasbord.
Not to mention the Quicksilver scene.
That when our first introduction to how much fun you could have with Quicksilver.
They told me you control metal.
Okay.
You know, my mom once knew a guy who could do that.
Okay, so after X-Men Days of Future Past, X-Men Apocalypse, another X-Men film that was met with a lot of mixed reviews, a little bit uneven. What do we think about Oscar Isaac, the Apocalypse, and that incarnation of Apocalypse?
I think great cast. I think it was a little bit of a missed opportunity to really bring to the screen a really interesting character, talking about immortality, talking about, Apocalypse en Sabanor, the first one, the very first mutant. And I think that Oscar Isaac loves the character. I think he loves the character because I feel like he also watched the show and loved Apocalypse from that era of comics and cartoons.
This Earth will be yours.
But some of those Hollywood creative decisions would be like, well, we can't make him blue. We got too many blue people, so he'll be kind of purpley. And it's like, well, now all the fans are going to rag on the fact that he looks kind of purpley. That's not.
Ivan Ooze.
Looks like Ivan Ooze. Fans have very long memories. We remember the Power Rangers movie. You can't just do something that looks kind of similar to that. But some really good stuff in there. Some great performances, great young actors. But I think it is still indicative of the sort of little bit of a missed opportunity.
I can't say a bad word against Oscar Isaac. The man's amazing. But in my heart, I hear John Colicos, who was the voice talent for us on Apocalypse, and just that
John Colicos.
big, deep voice. It's
and he was, because he was so much larger than life, and that's the thing that blew it up the movie for me. The first half hour, I was kind of in it, and because we tried when we did the animated show, we needed to make sure that he was so much larger than life. Other villains are little or dense or whatever. He was this larger than life thing that everybody else slammed against and died. There's a scene where they're just walking. Oscar Isaac is 5'9". There's nothing wrong with that. But they're just walking around in some broken down cityscape, and there's three or four X-Men, and there's him, and he's talking to them and chatting, and he's about to he's about the size of Jubilee. That's not Apocalypse. Apocalypse gets huge and destroys civilizations. He doesn't chat.
When the movie came out, I remember feeling like it could have been shot differently to add that scale. But then I think with the success of the character of Thanos in the most recent Avengers movies, being a CG character and having that scale, I mean, he's literally, he's like a 12-foot tall guy. Would you guys have gone CG and had Oscar Isaac provide the voice of Apocalypse?
Oh, sure.
Would that have been
just to maintain something that made him different?
The proportion,
Honestly, I wouldn't have used Apocalypse at all, or I would have changed it in some way. In my mind, that aside from weird structural things, the main problem is just, I like movies, especially superhero movies, where the villain has some kind of an emotional connection to the heroes. And, Sebastian Shaw, I agree with everything you said. Oh, but you killed my mother. Like that's why you like Sebastian Shaw as a villain and like to see him, he was much more like, what's his name, Steppenwolf in the Justice League movie. It's like, you're just a dude who wants to do some stuff.
Okay, and we just, so as we mentioned at the top, Dark Phoenix is now upon us, and I would love to hear some thoughts. It is not breaking any box office records.
I have had this conversation with some friends recently. We're talking about this. We're talking about Men in Black International opening to not great numbers. And Zack, maybe you can provide some insight with X-Men First Class. You mentioned how X-Men 3 The Last Stand, X-Men Origins Wolverine did great box office, but then sort of was thought of as not being great films. Did that affect X-Men First Class? Because what I'm saying is I think Dark Phoenix might be reeling from a little bit of people not being stoked about Apocalypse. You're only as good as your last movie.
I think franchise movies are very much the box office is very much a referendum on how people felt about the last one. And like First Class, people liked that. People liked that movie. didn't do any more money at the box office than X-Men Origins Wolverine. It's just, but then people watched it on video and like it got people, and then the next one did really well.
Yeah.
X-Men: The Last Stand, great box office because, in my mind, because people loved X2 and wanted to see more of wanted to see more of those characters.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think Dark Phoenix ran into the perfect storm of perception that it was a troubled production, underwhelming feelings about the last movie, and the fact that we're in the summer right now and we're in this new box office environment where if a movie isn't a must-see, people are waiting for video.
Yeah.
People are only rolling out for the must-sees because there's so many other entertainment options now.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm wondering too, there seemed to be, with the success of the Iron Man and Avengers and that whole Guardians of the Galaxy and the culmination of it, as a film goer, it's like, okay, they're heading in a certain direction and I'm going to go along for the ride.
Yeah.
Whereas with Dark Phoenix, I kind of had the feeling, I'm not sure where they thought they had set this up, that this was going to be the payoff, just as a fan of the thing.
Yeah.
Part of the problem for us was, I think Marvel created a little of this early. They weren't quite sure what the Phoenix was. It's inside Gene. It's inside Gene for a few years in the comics, and then for a few issues, oh, hi Phoenix. You want some coffee? Phoenix was not this super being that's inhabiting someone you love. She just kind of turned into Phoenix, and they didn't quite know what to do with her. And it just seemed all in the movie, it's just like, well, she's overheated.
Well, we talked about Days of Future Past. Let's just talk about the future. Great transition there, huh, you guys? So, where do you see them going? What do you want to see? What's the right move? Because you don't just plop them in there.
I would love for a wonderful new actor to be found to play Wolverine years from now. I'd love for Wolverine to interact with Hulk and some of the, because I love that side of the Wolverine storyline is when he gets to interact with some of those characters. But I would love for them to find and I love Hugh Jackman, an actor who is not classically handsome.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? You want 35-year-old Bob Hoskins.
Yes.
Is 35-year-old Bob Hoskins is who the next, or whoever his equivalent is who because there will be no Hugh Jackman comparisons. It's like this is a new interpretation of a classic character.
Yeah, and a lot of people, the movie-going audience, they don't realize that the comic book incarnation of Wolverine, he's 5'3".
He's short, hairy, and he says "bub" a lot.
Yeah, I saw a tongue-in-cheek petition online for Danny DeVito to play Wolverine, which, when you think about it, it's like, I mean, he's a little older now. But,
yes. Again, if this was 30 years ago and we could get Danny DeVito a trainer, I would be like, you know what, let's try him out. I would like to see that audition tape. I really would. But I would really love for a new X-Men movie to, similarly to X-Men First Class with a lot of those characters, to be set in the modern day, but have the X-Men be predominantly like 16-year-olds. To go back to those sort of first comics from the 60s, not set it in the 60s, but to have more of a vibe of like Spider-Man Homecoming, where you had, young Peter Parker. And my main thing is I want the movies to feel like they are about, the X-Men movies to feel like they're about the themes of tolerance and acceptance, and to talk about racism and to talk about prejudice in these ways. And I think that to have young people be the sort of voice of those movies, to reflect how young people right now are very politically active, the young people that have survived school shootings that are on Twitter and they're like, we're sick of your crap, this is what we believe. I would love to see some of those feelings and emotions find its way into an X-Men movie.
You mentioned First Class, and one of my favorite, just another scene that stands out from First Class is when the young people are together and like, what's your power? What do you got? And there is a joy that we hadn't quite seen in the other films. Are there other storylines, or what would you like to see infused into the MCU with X-Men?
Well, being a gal, sitting here as a female, I am not convinced that the women have been served as well as they might have been in every movie. And I would like to see that, because honestly, looking back at the X-Men animated show, it wasn't like, oh, this girl can fly, but that guy can't, so we can't, It was just, no, these are the people who happen to make up this team, and let's have them go do their thing. I would like to see the women, whoever they happen to be, just as integrated as the guys.
I'm not sure if we can do it now since we had established the Anna Paquin rogue, which was a legitimate rogue. I mean, she had been younger in the books when she started. But when we go around to cons and people ask us, 9 out of 10 of them say, we so loved how powerful Rogue was, and especially the female fans saying, give us a sense of empowerment, a sense she and Storm made us feel like we could be superheroes too, and the Rogue Gambit relationship, of all the relationships among them, still resonates 30 years later with the fans that talk to us.
Here's another thing I want to call too. I'm going to predict this, and I feel like it's going to happen. In the same way, when Michael Giacchino was hired to score Spider-Man: Homecoming, he used a little bit of the Spider-Man '60s theme.
Yes.
I guarantee you, Hal, we're going to hear X-Men: The Animated Series theme in some iteration in the films orchestrated. Like, we're going to hear it. I guarantee you. I guarantee you, we're going to hear it. We might even see two teams running at each other.
The Friends of Humanity running down the center, panic at the camera.
In that moment.
What a beautiful homage. That would be amazing. And Zack, in that incarnation, because I do love that, would they drop some MCU breadcrumbs in there? I mean, or would it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of treat it a little bit like the comics, in that the X-Men exist in the MCU, but you kind of want them off in their own adventures because, frankly, there's so many of them. If you put them together with the rest of the MCU, they kind of like
maybe like a hint, like in Daredevil, you just see the newspaper clippings about the Battle of New York or something like. But so it's there, but it's a totally other.
I think that a really smart thing to do, again, if you focus on a younger cast of characters, is that these young people have grown up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They're used to Iron Man and Thor flying around and Hulk and Captain America. They've grown up with that. So it would not be the craziest thing for me to have a Charles Xavier who's very reluctant to let his students go out and be superheroes. He wants to shelter his kids. He wants to train them and go, look, the world is a prejudiced, bad place. You will be hunted and feared. And the X-Men themselves, the 16-year-old kids are going, no, we're going to put on costumes. I'm Cyclops. I'm Marvel Girl. I'm Iceman. We're going to be like the Avengers. That's how we're going to get the world to treat us.
You make an excellent point, which is mutants appearing in a world where there have been 10 years of superheroes in the headlines saving people is very different from the movie in 2000 where you've got Senate hearings of who are these new humans with powers appearing, and they're what are they up to?
Erik, Julia, please, before we go, I would love to hear what that is right there.
This is a 2-year labor of love. We interviewed all the cast and the crew, the executives, the artists, and 450 pages and it's a history of what it was to like to make the show from the first day until the last day, and
that's beautiful.
And it has comments about all 76 of the episodes, images from all the storyboards about every one of the episodes, and it's really in fact has some fan letters that they sent to us saying, oh, you don't understand how much the show meant to us. So there are fan testimonials towards the back of it, but it's a celebration of the best job any of us ever had.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, if you're a fan of X-Men the Animated Series, which I would hope, that seems like a definitive tome.
Yeah, well, it's
available on jacobsbrownmedia.com, and if you look that up, if you buy through them, you will get an autographed copy because he will have pre-signed.
Yeah, go to them. Don't do Amazon.
Yeah, don't do Amazon. You get the hardback that's been signed, and or see us at a con when we're going to be in Albuquerque. Yeah. But yeah, no, this is, as I say, everybody, cast, crew, artists, everybody loved doing this show, and it all comes out in the book.
Amazing. Erik, Julia, so great to have you here. Thank you for being such a good friend to Screen Junkies and to the X-Men over the years. Great having you. Hector, thank you for bringing your knowledge. Zack, you as well, your knowledge and experience. Fascinating stuff. And I want to thank you for watching. What is your favorite X-Men film of all time? What is your favorite incarnation of X-Men? Let us know in the comments section below. And thanks again for watching Screen Junkies. I'm Hal Rudnick. Hit me up on Twitter and Instagram. Bye-bye.